After the very interesting panel session that was moderated by my distinguished colleague, Professor Antrustegui, we now proceed as planned and on time to the second panel, which is titled Technological Innovation and Advanced Energy Systems, with a very distinguished lineup of speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Lisa Kappler, who is an associate partner at Gleis Lutz in Stuttgart. Hallo, Frau Dr. Kappler.
Hello, Professor Metaxas. Thank you for having me
Very,
here.
very much looking forward to your presentation that will focus on sustainable aviation fuels. The question of the issue of its regulatory framework that governs this important topic, and of course compliance issues. Sie haben das Wort. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today, and I will provide a short overview of the regulatory landscape for sustainable aviation fuels, or short SAF. So there are various regulatory frameworks aimed at reducing emissions in the aviation sector, and I will highlight two of them. But first, I will briefly touch upon what sustainable aviation fuel actually means, and then I will outline the relevant international agreement and the EU's Refuel EU Aviation Regulation. Third, I will touch on complementary EU instruments such as the EU ETS. And finally, I will discuss briefly certification systems essential to market integrity before closing with a few key messages. So before we go any further, there's currently no standardized definition of SAF. So both the International Civil Aviation Organization and the EU have adopted their own definitions. So under the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, short CORSIA, a distinction is made between SAF and lower carbon aviation fuel. When we look what is SAF, SAF is defined as a renewable or waste-derived aviation fuel, which also meets the CORSIA sustainability criteria. Additional objectives of this SAF use include the conservation of land and biodiversity, as well as the protection of human and labor rights. On the other hand, lower carbon aviation fuel, which is also a fuel defined by CORSIA, refers to a fossil-based aviation fuel that meets the CORSIA sustainability criteria, and thus this term encompasses a mixture of fossil fuel and SAF. Both of the fuels must result in at least a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The EU also has a definition for SAF defined in the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation, and this is aviation fuel that is either synthetic based on biofuels, or based on recycled carbon. So what does synthetic aviation fuel means? It means that it's a fuel made out of renewables from non-biological origin. Aviation biofuels, on the other hand, are liquid fuels produced from biomass, such as feedstock, with exception of food and feed crops. And recycled carbon aviation fuels are fuels that are produced from liquid or solid waste streams of non-renewable origin that are suitable for material recovery. And the EU definition is therefore slightly more precise and differentiated than the definition used under CORSIA. So as already mentioned at a high level, what does CORSIA actually means? It's the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation that the International Civil Aviation Organization has developed for methods and standards for the reduction of greenhouse gases. So this agreement was adopted in 2018 and is being implemented in 3 phases. The first 2 phases are based on voluntary participation, whereas the participation in the third phase, starting in 2027, will be mandatory for all 192 UN member states. And as of next year, a total of 130 member states will participate voluntarily in the CORSIA, including all 27 EU member states. So what is the aim of the CORSIA agreement? The aim is to ensure that future growth in the aviation sector becomes carbon neutral from 2020 onwards, and to achieve climate neutrality for the entire aviation sector by 2050. And of the targeted emission reductions, it is planned that 65% are achieved through the use of SAF. And to ensure compliance with these goals, CORSIA implements reporting duties and offsetting mechanisms for the party states. So there's an obligation to monitor, report, and verify CO2 compliance, CO2 emissions from flights. And this applies to all airplane operators conducting international flights and producing annual CO2 emissions above 10,000 tons. And these reporting obligations apply to those airplane operators, even if the states between which they operate the flights are not yet voluntary participants in the CORSIA offsetting. And by contrast, the CORSIA offsetting, on the other hand, these requirements apply only to the states that voluntarily participate to CORSIA. And since 2021, operators can reduce their CORSIA offsetting requirements by claiming emissions reductions from CORSIA eligible fuels. So as of 2027, all UN member states will be required to comply with the offsetting requirements under the CORSIA regime. So consequently, the distinction will largely become obsolete. So when turning to the EU, the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation is part of the European Green Deal, and it aims to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And under the European climate law, member states have committed to reduce the net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55%. And the regulation is intended to contribute to achieving this target and entered into force on January 1st of this year. So the goal is basically to implement economic instruments that aim at reducing the carbon emissions from any aircraft departing from EU airports. And it also wants to develop a market for the production and the supply of SAF. So the regulation specifically sets mandatory requirements for the use of SAF, which is the key difference from the CORSIA agreement. So while CORSIA provides incentives for SAF use, it does not impose any mandatory obligation, but under the EU regulation, there is an established minimum SAF blending requirement in aviation fuel. So SAFs have the potential to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the aviation sector, but nevertheless, their use have been largely untapped so far. Prior to the adoption of the EU regulation, SAF usage amounted only to 0.05%, which is almost nothing, of total aviation fuels. So in addition to the mandatory blending quotas for SAF, the regulation also includes provisions regarding refueling obligations for aircraft operators in the EU, and also an obligation for airport managing bodies to facilitate the access to SAF. The regulation has also an enforcement of rules and penalties applicable to certain infringements. So when looking at the quota, concretely, the regulation sets out a clear escalating schedule for the minimum SAF shares in aviation fuels supplied at EU airports, which you can see here, and include the minimum synthetic subquotas. So the minimum shares of SAF are from January 1st this year. It's a 2% share of SAF, which should be entailed in aviation fuel. And then this figure increases every 5 years until from 2050, each year a minimum share of 70% of SAF and a minimum share of 35% of synthetic aviation fuel is required. So this trajectory kind of provides the core commercial signal to producers as well as to suppliers, anchoring to plan, to contract, and also to project financing for both bio-based and power-to-liquid pathways. In this context, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency has also published their first annual technical report reflecting on 2024 data, and it contains information on the status of compliance as well as insights into the state and development of the SAF market within the EU. So even if the regulation was not yet applicable when the data was collected, the report provides a valuable overview of the current state and can also serve as a reference point for assessing future progress. So in total, when looking at the data, 32.1 million tons of aviation fuel were supplied to EU airports, of which 0.6% was SAF last year. So that's already an increase to the 0.05% mentioned earlier. So despite this progress, there remains substantial optimization potential. And according to the reports submitted by aviation fuel suppliers, the 2024 SAF supply to EU airports consisted almost entirely of aviation biofuels. That is the 98% mentioned here, with the majority derived from used cooking oil as feedstock. And most of these feedstocks supplied did not originate from EU countries. The reported SAF achieved average greenhouse gas emission savings of 91% compared to the conventional jet fuel it replaced. So when touching on complementary EU instruments, alongside the CORSIA offsetting system, the European Emission Trading System, short EU ETS, continues to apply. And the EU ETS has covered CO2 emissions from the aviation sector since 2012, and it imposes an obligation on airline operators to not only monitor, but also to report and verify their respective emissions. And they also have to surrender corresponding allowances corresponding to those emissions. The carbon pricing under the EU ETS is higher and thus more ambitious than the CORSIA system. However, the EU ETS only applies to flights within the European Economic Area or Switzerland or UK. Flights to other countries are compensated under CORSIA. The currently applicable version of the Energy Taxation Directive has remained unchanged since its adoption in 2023. But however, due to radical changes in the underlying climate and energy policy framework, the directive does not no longer align with current EU policies. Therefore, the EU Commission adopted a proposal for a revision, which aims to not only harmonize the taxation of energy products, but also to promote clean technologies as well as to remove outdated exemptions and also to reduce rates that currently encourage the use of fossil fuels. However, just a few weeks ago, the EU finance ministers failed to reach an agreement on this. So therefore, the negotiations will have to continue under the next council presidency. And thus it remains still uncertain whether and in what form taxation will be introduced in the aviation sector. When also turning to the Renewable Energy Directive 3, RED 3, the EU has strengthened its binding targets for the expansion of renewable energy sources compared to the RED 2, which was previously applicable. And with respect to the aviation sector, no amendments have been introduced compared to RED 2. So it's still a partial exemption continues to apply in the calculation of the gross final consumption of energy for the aviation sector. In the context of the SAF use, however, it's also of great importance to verify the sustainable production of those fuels in order to avoid negative environmental or social repercussions. So put simply, certification underpins trust in SAF claims. Two families of schemes are central. It's the ISCC and the RSB. The ISCC, the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification, addresses this need and enhances traceability through site-specific audits. So it's basically a globally applicable certification scheme for the sustainability of feedstocks and products, traceability through the supply chain, as well as the determination of greenhouse gas emissions and savings. The ICC operates under different certification systems for different markets. So for example, the ICC CORSIA or the ICC CORSIA Plus, those are certification systems that demonstrate compliance with the CORSIA requirements for aviation fuels. The difference between those two systems is the scope of sustainability requirements that they cover. There's also a certification called ISCC EU. It's a scheme that has been fully recognized by the EU Commission. So with this certification, the compliance with the legal requirements for sustainability and greenhouse gas emission savings as criteria of the RED 3 for all EU member states can be verified. And then for the non-regulated markets, there's the ISCC Plus certification, which is often used for making self-claims in those non-regulated markets. The second scheme of certifications is the RSB standard. It's the Round Table on Sustainable Biomaterials. This is a certification system for sustainable fuels and materials derived from biomass, waste, and residues. And this standard recognizes producers and processors of biomass and biofuels who comply with rigorous criteria for social responsibility and environmental protection, and thus thereby exceeding both as the minimum requirements set out in RED 3, as well as the CORSIA sustainability requirements. So the requirements are even higher. And also this certification scheme for fuels offers several different variants. So for example, there's the RSB Global Fuel Certification. This applies to fuels produced anywhere in the world, excluding the EU regulated market. For the EU regulated market, you can obtain the RSB EU Red Fuel certification, which is also recognized by the European Commission for certifying compliance with the Red 3. And finally, there's also a CORSIA specific certification, which is the RSB CORSIA certification, and it's a scheme specifically related to SAF, and it specifies requirements for operators along the supply chain to produce SAF that is eligible under CORSIA and complies with RSP sustainability requirements. So to wrap up, I have 3 closing points. So first, SAF is a primary lever to decarbonize aviation in the medium term, reflecting in both international and EU policy. Second, the EU's Refuel EU regulation makes self-blending mandatory on an accelerating trajectory, while CORSIA embeds global measurement, reporting, and verification, and thus creates value for certified low-carbon fuels. Third, robust certification is indispensable to market credibility and credible enforcement, which will also drive compliance. For the industry in total, the strategic imperative is to secure certified self-supply, to align corporate transition plans, and to scale investments in advance and synthetic fuels to meet the binding 2030 to 2050 milestones. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. This was indeed very insightful. You also highlighted the flanking EU regulatory instruments, certification issues, but in general, this subject is a very important one for the energy transition. So it's very important and significant to assess the regulatory maturity as regards the penetration of sustainable aviation fuels. And I also look forward to a possible short discussion after we have the pleasure of having all the speakers in this panel presenting their contributions, and I would be very much looking forward if you could, if your program allows you to stay with us.
Yes, most certainly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kappler.